All right, fact check this podcast, and tonight I am joined by Patriot Way Media and Mike Korbel of the Invictus Mind, and we are going to talk about Christian nationalism. But first, I'm going to let the guys introduce themselves. So, whoever wants to go first, go ahead and kind of tell people a little bit about yourself, and then we'll kind of take it off.
Sure, I'll go ahead and jump in here. Justin, first, thanks for having me on. I am Patriot Way Media. I am an anonymous Twitter media personality that trolls libertarians and anarchists, and that's about it. I got a website, Patriot Way Media. I kind of dabble and I fake pretend at being like an intellectual, but I'm really not. So that's about it. Thanks.
All right. Well, thanks again, Justin. My name is Mike Korbel. I'm from the Invictus Mind podcast. We talk about financial freedom, spiritual freedom, and political freedom. I'm not as consistent as Dave Smith, but every once in a while I have a show on, and I'm happy to be on this one.
Yeah, I'm not all that consistent myself. I've been pretty good about two a week, but with things going on, life gets in the way sometimes, and I have to take care of other stuff, like those things in there that are probably being loud and coming through on the mic. So tonight we are going to talk about Christian nationalism, and this has kind of gotten a lot of attention just over the last several months because of the whole Marjorie Taylor Greene stuff, and then I don't know, it gets kicked around in the news or in mainstream media and social media here and there of late, and it's one of those things that I've been putting some thought into, and I wanted to explore some of the different sides of Christian nationalism, what it means to y'all, what your experiences are with it, and kind of like the positives and negatives, and what you would like to see maybe come from that sort of a movement. So let's start with that. What would you consider like a definition of Christian nationalism?
I'll go ahead and jump in here, Justin. I will say that from my experience, I've recently attended a Protestant non-denominational church right around the corner from my house. It's just convenient for our family. They have kids, and I have kids, and therefore, and so on July 4th, or actually it was a Sunday before July 4th, they handed out this document called the Watchman Decree, and I shared that with you, Justin. I'm not sure if you'll be able to share that with the viewers or not, but you know, in general, what I see here is that there is there appears to be a mixing of Protestant Christianity with, you know, American nationalism. That's what it seems like to me. Now, that may not be fair necessarily, but I think that at large, this is a Protestant America, and there is you know, great patriotism, you know, from those type of people, and I see, you know, kind of the fusing of both patriotism and Christianity in one, and I see some potential problems, you know, with that down the line, but it's not entirely bad, but we'll have a chance to kind of flesh it out.
Yeah, I'm not going to read that whole thing right now, but you know, we can discuss it. You know, I think the most important thing that we could do in any discussion like this is kind of hash out definitions. You know, I don't know the two of you that well, and I suppose you don't know me that well. I'm very inactive on Twitter. Sometimes I chime in, sometimes I don't. But I have been a Christian, at least active for the last 20 years. I think when it comes to the idea of Christian nationalism, I'm going to start by saying that on one hand, I agree with the tenets of it. On the other hand, I don't, and we'll hash that out. But I look at it this way: I think it's a false dichotomy that's presented, and what I mean by that is that if we had given a choice between globalism coming from, like, you know, Geneva, Switzerland, or the World Economic Forum, or Christian nationalism and just being here in America, I'd probably just choose the Christian nationalism. That being said, I wouldn't identify myself as a Christian nationalist at all. I think there's many problems with that idea. But because it is a false dichotomy, as I mentioned, maybe we'll talk about one versus the other as to which one is better or not.
We can dive into that, because I mean, yes, if it is just a binary option between one or the other, I think most people in our circles for sure would probably say, well, yeah, the Christian nationalism is definitely the better alternative to like some sort of a globalism, and honestly, anybody who's at all right of complete woke progressive is probably going to say something at least similar to that, or at least have that as a temperance for globalism to some degree or another. So yeah, let's kind of talk about that. Like, what is this Christian nationalism that's kind of been brought up in the media of late a direct response in some way to a lot of the push for globalism?
I think it is a response to it, although I don't know when you say as of late. I mean, we're going back to 2016 with the beginning of the Trump era, or just in the last couple of years. I don't really know.
I think I've seen it more prominently in the news of the last couple of years. I do think that it started probably pre-Trump, probably around the time of Oberfeld and the Supreme Court allowing gay marriage. I think that's when it sort of started, but I think it really has come into more of a spotlight over just the last 2 years or so.
Yeah, I think we're going to run into trouble here with this discussion if we can't, kind of define, our parameters, because I think that one of the things that a Protestant Christian, I know that like my family, are all Protestants, the immediate, kind of boomer truth that they would say is, well, this country was built upon Protestant ideals. It was, a creation of, mostly Christian men and so forth. And probably what they would, even further push back on is to say we are just merely reclaiming, our heritage of this nation. And so this is why I have an issue with, with this movement at large, because that document that was passed out, and this is not something that document, the Watchman Decree, I should say, was not something unique to that one particular church that I went to. That is something that was distributed across the country. If you go into Twitter and type in Christian Nationalism, Watchman Decree, you've got all the blue check marks, shrieking, in agony about the rising fascism, that's on the horizon, in Christian churches. But in that very first or the second sentence on that document, it says, I agree to be a watchman over our nation concerning its people and their rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And what I would interject right here is that the moment in which you fuse Christianity with Enlightenment principles, you are going to run into some trouble. And I think, and that trouble is exactly where we are at right now in 2022, which is you can't have it both ways. You can't say that you're Christian, but also hold on to these ideals of modernity and of the Enlightenment. I think that's going to cause problems.
I agree with you, Patriot. We will. If we get too much into the weeds as far as the definition of Christianity, that might take us off the rails, because you've mentioned Protestantism a couple of times. Justin, I don't know what faith tenet you belong to. I'm a Latter-day Saint, otherwise known as a Mormon. So, I think we should keep it within, some kind of biblical perspective rather than getting off in tangents as to, the difference between our theology. But I think there is a lot of crossover between several different faiths and this Americanism that we're seeing in all churches in this country.
That's definitely something that I've looked at and talked about and put a lot of thought into of late, is the the modernity of the church. We're seeing that. So I was raised Methodist, and I guess more or less I still kind of align with Methodism, even though I'm mostly more Protestant, non-denominational, and I have been of late. I dabble more in Orthodoxy and reading into and looking into that side of Christianity. But I was raised Christian, and I've been Christian all my life. But like with the Methodist Church, you're seeing a huge schism between the American Methodist Church and the global Methodist Church over transgenderism, over gay rights, over a lot of biblical stuff that the American church is moving much more progressive, whereas the global church is sticking to biblical principles. So yeah, I mean, we probably should draw the line in, regardless of denomination, like the Bible has to be where the line is drawn as far as the Christian nationalism goes. Like it can't be any sort of a Christian nationalism that is pandering to progressivism and that sort of stuff is not going to be something that's actually effective or will create any type of a change that's going to be meaningful in society. So like that's probably defining line one, is like it has to be defined as legitimately biblical, not the modern progressive type of church.
And Justin, I agree with you 100%, and I would say that the people that are pushing forth what I see, whether it's the Marjorie Taylor Greens of the world or this church that I attend, I think that they are definitely on the right side of the aisle, in terms of being pro-life, being pro-2A, just in general being either conservative or right-wing. I think that you could even draw that line very broadly, across many different Christian denominations. I think that there's probably, Catholics and, other, a wide variety of Christians that would align themselves with these ideals. And to be quite transparent with you, I think that if you ask me today, what would I prefer as my kind of government of choice, I would say I'm very much a theocrat. Like, let's have a theocracy, because I think that anything. I think that we're just kind of fooling ourselves thinking that we can keep religion separated, from state. The point that I'm trying to make right here is that I don't know that these current Christians, these current predominantly Protestants, that are clinging to these traditional American values of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, I don't think that that's going to get them where they want to go in terms of creating a Christian nation. And the reason why I say that is because this nation started with those principles, and we've ended up with all this wokeness. And I'm happy to defend that claim.
Well, I think that life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, obviously that's in our founding documents, but I think that we need to lay out the definition of what nation really means. Because when this country started in 1776, we were not known as a nation, right? We might have been called a union at the time, and that was more predominantly language used around the Civil War era, but it was post-Civil War that we became a sovereign nation. I mean, we started as colonies and it became states, but you can go back to Rothbard, I think it was, who defined what the word nation means. Nation is a group of people who share similar culture, similar ideology, religion, usually similar language, look kind of the same. So that's a nation, right? America has never been, in my estimation, a nation, despite whether they call it a nation or not. It's not really a nation by design. And so to go back to being called a Christian nation, that's just incorrect terminology to begin with.
Yeah, and that's, I don't believe, based on the founding documents and stuff, it doesn't seem like the founders intended for it to be, number one, they didn't intend for it to be like a true democracy, and they didn't intend for it to be like some sort of a nation. It was a collection of states. It was always a republic, and like you said, more of a union. So over the last hundred and
These American, what is it? These United States of America, they switched it on us, to where now it is just the United States of America. Pre-Civil War, it was these, it was plural. So I very much agree with what it is that you guys are saying.
Well, if
yeah,
anyone's, I've been to like, I'm sorry, I've been to like,
no, go ahead.
I've been to like 35 of these United States. That's still about 15 or so I haven't actually set foot in. But anyone who's been around the country as much as I have can tell you that the North New England states and states like Florida and Georgia, and then of course the Western states, they all have different cultures. They have different types of people, several different religions, and so this is not a unified monolith of any kind of nation by strict definition.
I think to that point, I've lived in, I can't remember what it is now, 7 or 9 different states over the last 20 years or so, and traveled to 25 different states. Like you're saying, they are, every state kind of has its own unique culture and kind of demographics, and even different parts of different states has very, very distinctly different cultures, and to try to think that all of that can just become this one unified nation, like you were talking about with the definition of a nation, is a nation is by definition unified, and what we are is just a big collection of hodgepodge that is held together by, at this point I'm not really sure what, maybe the final result of this whole Christian nationality thing is not that it is one unified Christian nation, but that it is a bunch of individual Christian nations within the larger landmass that is currently the United States. Like looking at this stuff, anybody who's pushing for like a one nation type of thing, I don't feel like they've spent much time traveling. I don't feel like they've had much experience with seeing the significant differences between New York and New Jersey, and even like New Hampshire and different parts of Connecticut versus Mississippi and Louisiana, or Georgia and Alabama, Kentucky and Indiana and Tennessee. Like everything's very regional and everything's very different no matter where you go, and to expect the whole thing to just like be this one contiguous unit is kind of ludicrous in my opinion. I'm also a little bit more of a separatist, I guess. I'm all for state breaking up, and as you said, it was these United States, not the United States, meaning they were individuals, and they had the opportunity or the ability to say, hey, look, this isn't right, and we don't want to do this anymore. Like that was built into the design of the whole thing, and somewhere along the lines that got perverted or just thrown out the window entirely.
Mike, I really appreciate the fact that you've clarified the definition of what a nation is, and if we are going by this particular definition, of a nation, which is a group of people that share a culture, share a religion, a language, common values, then I think that there's absolutely a place for Christian nationalism within this country at large. But I'm going to continue referring back to this document. I apologize, because this is kind of what is in my head in terms of what I think that if there is a group of people that is pushing Christians, within these within these churches, nationwide, they are pushing them in a direction where it's very much the opposite of what it is that we're discussing. I've been referencing the Amish quite a bit in my conversations here lately. I grew up pretty close to the Amish when I was a young kid. I actually did work with the Amish. I would stack hay and deliver hay to and from these Amish communities, and they are closed communities, and in many ways you could say that like they are their own nation as such. And if we are going to define Christian nationalism as something that resembles maybe an Amish community, like, I'm all on board with that. However, I don't think that is really the message that is being pushed by many of the people with a voice at the top of these influential churches in this country. And I think that they have illusions of taking back the country, taking back DC, taking back the Washington Post and the New York Times and the banks. And I think the moment in which you begin to believe that that's possible, like you're just on a suicide mission. You're jumping out of a plane without a parachute, in my opinion.
That's something that I kind of wanted to start moving into, is because we've kind of established the definitions of like what we're sort of talking about as far as Christianity goes, and what we're sort of talking about as far as the definitions of nationalism. So what is this? What is the Christian nationalism that's being pushed in the news? It's this idea that Christians are going to use the different offices of government at a federal level to mandate and legislate in a Christian manner, and enforce Christianity on the country. And yeah, when I read this Watchman decree, like there's a lot of, maybe not explicitly, but it kind of moves in that direction with some of the wording, especially if this is getting shared by leftists, like, they're twisting that as far as they can in that direction. And I don't think, like, for me personally, I don't think that's the kind of, let me rephrase this. I would not necessarily be opposed to that, but I don't think that's something that would have a functional effectiveness in the country. Does that make sense?
What's interesting is that both the left and the right are coming from the same place in my mind. What I mean by that is, like, we could talk about, some of the really wacky ideas that the left comes up with, especially with the transhuman movement and everything like that, and with the woke culture. But, I've heard several different influencers talk about this principle, and, mimesis, right? People are copying each other, and it all stems from Christianity. So you can break apart wokeism, and you can say, well, they have, they're fighting for the little guy, the oppressed, the individual rights, and all that idea of individualism is, a Christian idea, right? And so maybe they're Christianity without Christ, but they're still trying to use the government, as a force to make sure everyone lives according to their idea of Christianity, whether they want to accept Christ as a savior or not. It's the same basis, same kind of structure. And of course, on the right, it's the same thing, but they have a different idea of what Christianity really means. And it's not this transhumanism, but they're trying to use the government to, okay, we want to enforce everybody to live this way, right? So they're both coming from the same general background, the same idea of Christianity, but they're defining that term Christianity as meaning one of or something else. That's why I think, like, having a clear definition of what that means, going back to that biblical principle. Okay, well, we can look into the Bible and say, well, wokeism is not Christianity because this verse, and this verse, it says that in the Bible, but it's the same basic thing in my mind.
Well, and like the the incredibly right-wing version of like almost an authoritarian type of Christianity, I don't think that's biblical either. There are plenty of examples where the Bible kind of encourages against that sort of thing, like not utilizing Christian influence to take control of state apparatus and stuff like that. Like I don't think that type of institutional Christianity is very biblical either.
Well, when you actually invited me to do this podcast, I was looking up some things, and I got a bunch of notes here. So I wanted to share something I heard the other day.
Hey, quit showing off, Mike. You actually did research for this? Come on now.
This is like the first episode I've invited people on that I didn't give you an article to read and make you do homework beforehand. So I'm proud of you.
It actually it kind of goes along with another guest I'm going to have on my own show, so I'm going to use the same notes twice here. But so if you want to talk about what the Bible actually says, and I started by talking about the difference between American nationalism, right, Christian nationalism, and this global empire, right? So let's just put aside this idea of a global empire, because we all agree that we don't want to go there.
Yep.
But if you go back to the Bible, I'm thinking of the Tower of Babel story, the Tower of Babel. So, and there's different interpretations of the story, but the basic premise is that everybody in the general area, which was the first empire of Babylon, that's where the word Babel comes from, Babel, they all were kind of like trying to, put themselves up at the God's level, right? So the story in the Bible goes that they all got together and they were trying to build a tower to heaven to bring God down to their level. And it's just kind of led by this guy named Nimrod, who is this emperor, like this mighty man in scriptures. And so they had this first empire, and they were trying to excel themselves above God. And God didn't really like that they were doing this. So what happened in the story is that he confounded all their languages, made them speak different languages, destroyed the tower, and they all went separate ways. And so in the Bible, in the book of Genesis, God doesn't really like this globalism idea, right? Because when people get together and they build these things, they try to excel themselves above God. He's like, I'm not having any of that. So he confounded their language, right? That's what Babel means, right? So they couldn't understand each other. And so I made a joke, kind of tongue in cheek, that that was God's choosing nationalism over globalism, but that's not the truth either.
Hold up, I got talks coming in.
So, so obviously we can look at that story and compare it to what's going on today. We want to have everybody, all these elites are trying to make one world government. We're trying to make ourselves like God. We're trying to control everybody on a worldly scale, right? And God, again, in the Bible said, well, you're not above God. You can't exalt yourself above God. So we're gonna bring you down and separate, into separate nations and separate cultures. And since that time, we've had that idea that there's all these different countries that exist out there.
This is a really good point, Mike, and it reminds me of reading Moldbug because he in one of, I think it was in Unqualified Reservations, he was talking about the progressive spirit of universalizing everything, right? And also how the kind of the I hate to say American spirit because that's kind of a loaded phrase, but essentially Americanism blended Puritanism, which is this idea of like purifying all of the, I guess, evil, from the culture, but then at the same time trying to universalize, the culture into one. And so going back to what we were talking about earlier, which was America was never supposed to be this singular American culture. It was always supposed to be, and in a lot of ways, it was supposed to be multicultural. I mean, it was multicultural, even though the left hijacked and has bastardized that term multicultural. But if you think about it, the very genesis of this country was it was always about English and Scottish and Irish and Italian. Eventually there were Italians and then another wave of immigration. With Jewish immigrants and so on and so forth. And somewhere along the line, like there was this progressive spirit to try to kind of unify everything kind of into one. So maybe we are seeing the fruits of this mistake. And yes, it was not the intention of the founders for that to happen. But this is where we're at right now, where there is a singular force in DC that is telling all of us how we are supposed to live, how we are supposed to think. And on top of that, if you don't respect somebody's pronouns, well, you're a bigot and a fascist and et cetera, et cetera. So if there is room for a Christian nationalist, in this space, what I would say is that we have to build our community, kind of inside of this. Pete Q, is always talking about, the Hoppian, private community and privatized cities and so forth. I think that there is room for us for Christians to network together, within the empire. I don't think that it's necessarily reasonable to say, hey, we're going to send all of these politicians that are Christians, to take back DC or even, the state capitals, for that matter. I don't know if that's necessarily realistic. I think it's more realistic to say, let's build our own, sub-nations within the broader fallen culture.
Well, that's like you had talked about the Amish earlier, and there are also like Catholic covenant community types. We had talked about some of that on an episode I did a few weeks ago, where we talked about like farmers markets and stuff. And what this lady had, who had written this article, had described as white nationalism amongst these rural farmers markets, and like it's not that they're, it's not that they're Christian nationals. It's not that they're white nationals. It's that they are a sort of a miniature nation unto themselves. It is a bunch of people with similar values, similar goals, similar like lifestyles that have come together and kind of formed these communities. And then when somebody like her, who is much more progressive and left-leaning, comes in and is participating in this, like it's offensive to her, because that's not her, like those values are not her shared values. But that's why they are covenant communities type of things, even though they're not, like the farmers markets themselves aren't, they're not strictly or like definitionally covenant communities. The people who are getting together in those, to some extent, are, and so like that's the thing that, when looking at Christian nationalism and stuff, and when you were talking about like the founding of the nation and the different groups that were coming here, and kind of the melting pot, as it were, in that time, all of those groups up to a point were very similar. They had similar goals, similar values and principles. Like they were, while they came from different countries and had different backgrounds and even to some extent, varying differences in religion and stuff like that, they were all mostly the same and sort of homogenous up to a point. And then at that point, then it became this like melting pot and started moving its way into, progressivism, where you have a lot of groups that don't align. And then for some reason, at some point in history, it stopped being okay to have a place like New York, where you have, almost exclusively black communities and black parts of town. You have Chinatown. You have, very Orthodox Jewish parts of the city. For some reason, it became, all of this has to be smashed together and made into one big thing, and that's where things started to break down. And you're seeing that happen. You're seeing that happen currently all across Europe. Like Sweden is a prime example, and I've talked about Sweden too much over the last couple of years because they have been a kind of a shining example both of a country that handled the pandemic well, but also a lot of this like forced immigration and stuff that's not playing out well. Like Sweden had some of the most stringent immigration policies on the planet. Just for shits and giggles, I looked into it in 2020 to see like what would it take to move to Sweden. You're not doing it is basically the answer. Like there were a lot of stipulations. You had to have a job. You had to have a minimum, like a certain minimum provable income before you could move there. You had to have like references. It was a lot. But then Sweden also, through the whole EU bullshit, had to start letting in a certain number of Middle Eastern immigrants, and they were all getting dumped in Stockholm, and it has completely wrecked Stockholm, and it has created a rise of what would in the United States be referred to as like ultra MAGA or dark MAGA. Like it is incredibly right-wing nationalistic movement that's come up in Sweden as a direct response to that, because it's completely wrecking their society, and it's wrecking the culture that they had as a country because of like what they've done with this forced immigration and trying to create this like melting pot that's clearly not working. This social experiment is kind of failing. So I think that's something with the Christian nationalism side of it is like what I would want to see is more covenant community type things, and making that like the national divorce thing, whether it happens, I think it's likely, just the looking at history and based on like looking at the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. Like I think we're in the decline of this empire, and it's going to dissolve and break up, and then it will become, European sized nation states. And then at that point, people are going to have to decide where they want to live, and you're going to see stuff like the New York governor saying that MAGA folks should get out of New York. I agree; they absolutely should be getting out of New York. And if you're not a MAGA type folk, you should probably be getting out of Indiana. Like, just this probably is not the place for you, right? Like, it feels like we should be moving in that direction. So, like, that's kind of the idea of Christian nationalism that I would be a little more aligned with. I'm not a big fan of the idea of wielding the power of the state for the explicit intentions of promoting Christianity. I do at least think the idea of the separation of church and state is something that I think the leftists and progressives, and especially the atheists, take that way too far. But there is some value in like not having the state be explicitly religious in a way. But I also see value in it. I mean, you look at certain Middle Eastern nations where their religion and faith is directly tied to the way they govern. And I don't want to say that they're good, but like they don't have a lot of certain problems because of that marriage of the two. So I can see it both ways, but I just don't think it works on this scale.
Yeah, all bad things start in Washington, D.C. I took my daughter there in 2019, and man, I hate that hellhole. It's just like the swamp should just like go away. So at the time, that was 3 years ago now. So she was like 9, and I said, we're going to Washington, D.C. I was there for a company trip, and she had never been there. So I said, okay, I guess you can come with me. And she called it Washington disease, which I thought was cute. And I was like, yeah, she's absolutely right. And so the fact is that everybody wants to use this tool, this disease to make their country into the way they see fit. But this idea that we were ever a Christian nation, it's just preposterous. I mean, even among Christian sects, you talked about multiculturalism a little bit, Justin, and a lot of the white Europeans that came over to the Americas, they got along with each other unless you were Irish. right? The Irish were notoriously like a lot of racism against the Irish. And of course, I'm not going to excuse what happened in the South with the African slaves, because that's another group. But even the Protestants and the Catholics didn't get along with each other. In fact, it was very vitriol up in New York in the 1820s. There was a whole religious argument going on where the Protestants were arguing among themselves about which religion was correct, and the Catholics were there. And of course, my faith, the Mormons, were pretty much kicked out of every state until they landed in Utah. And the Jehovah's Witnesses back in, I don't know if you know this or not, but back in 1940, the Jehovah's Witnesses, there was a whole bunch of stuff that happened with them because they don't even believe in this idea of patriotism or saluting the flag or anything like that. So there was a story I was just checking out. Jehovah's Witnesses, there was like 335 different basically aggressive movements or riots against the Jehovah's Witnesses because they didn't want to salute the flag. And so all these people are like beating them because like, you're not American enough. And it's like, okay. And so our country is filled with history that we never got along. There's never been a pure Christian ideology in this country. And so this idea that they can, unite everybody using Washington, D.C. to have one Christian standard, it's ridiculous. It's never been like that, and it never will. It's impossible.
Yeah, I agree. The idea of it's just too, you see it play out just between the denominations. Like, for whatever reason, no matter how similar Presbyterians and Methodists and some of the others are, there's still like some degree of infighting amongst the different denominations of the church. I mean, I've been a member of just about every one at some point in my travels and moving around the country. And at the end of the day, it's as long as they're preaching the word of God and based on the Bible and focused on Jesus and focused on the Bible, none of that other stuff matters, which is just silly.
The one thing that I would say is that this country has been tolerant of Christian denominations as long as it's within a certain boundary. And Protestantism is real funky because obviously, like, the Mormons are technically, I don't know, Mike, you could correct me here, but I mean, technically they're Protestant, but they're not exactly Protestant. But and because of that, they have received persecution because they're not exactly within the acceptable boundaries of the Presbyterians, Methodists, Baptists, kind of the mainline Protestants. And so the way that I've seen history, and of course throughout all of this, Americans traditionally have looked at the Catholics with a great deal of suspicion. When JFK was elected in 1960, there were all of these conspiracy theories that here now the Pope is going to be running the United States of America. And so the way that I look at it, and of course I could be wrong, but the way that I look at it is that this country from its inception was very much Protestant, but there were always guardrails, in terms of what was acceptable Christianity. And that's why I kind of go back to this idea of no matter what your government is, it's going to be informed by some sort of religion. Now, it can be explicitly, Muslim law or Shia law or whatever it is, or it can kind of be, behind the veil. And that's what I've seen with American government and American law, which is it's been informed by kind of this blend of vaguely Protestant Christianity, and the final result of this is the final result of Protestantism is to just eventually separate Christ and the church and the Holy Spirit, away from all of this, and we just end up, with the church of woke, as it were. But everything that you guys say, I tend to agree with, except for this notion that at any given time, I don't think that we've ever had kind of a neutral government that is just void of religion or Christianity. I think it's always been there, but it's always been, kind of shrouded, so to speak.
Yeah, I want to address one thing, Patriot. So as far as Mormons being Protestant, I mean, I guess you can lump them in by that definition because we're not Catholic or Orthodox. But you would find that there's a lot of differences in doctrine between Protestantism and Mormonism.
Yes.
But the point I'm saying with that is, I mean, that's a very personal thing. So you can't separate, like we can have this idea of separate church and state, but I don't think it's possible because religion is inherently an important thing for all people. And so they're going to hold to that, whatever their doctrine happens to be, as a personal, important thing. And so Christianity as a whole has a problem historically because obviously they want to spread this message of Jesus Christ, but you can go back, back to the Crusades and say, okay, well, what happened during the Crusades? Like they had all these other cultures infiltrating Europe, and the Christians didn't like that, so they had these wars, right? That's inherently not a Christian principle, by the way, is war. And so people have been fighting against each other because of this personal narrative that they want to live their lives by. So you hear nowadays a lot of Catholics and Orthodox and of that ilk will say, well, it's the fault of the Enlightenment, right? The Protestant Reformation or whatever. And the Protestants will say, well, we don't like the Catholics because, they were mixing with the state, right? So Catholicism, you go again, going back to the Middle Ages, the great empires of Europe and Byzantium, and they had this mixture of church and state, and the Protestants wanted to separate themselves from that, right? And of course, now in America, we want to go back to this. Okay, let's mix with the state again, and it's like that's the problem right there. It's like anytime that we mix state and our religion, there's going to be a problem because Christianity may have a good message no matter what sect you come from, but when you want to use force of the state, the monopoly on violence to push that idea on a whole, it's going to cause problems, and that's diametrically opposed to the message of Christ himself. Is like, you don't need to sit there and use the state, just do away with this force, right? But Christians have been doing it for 2,000 years. So I mean, where does it start? Where does it end? I mean, that's just the idea that's flawed from the beginning.
Yeah, so I'm a big proponent of Christian nationalism, but when I say that, I don't mean I don't mean the church has a direct influence on the state. I think as a nation, we need to return to biblical principles and ideals and a foundation of that, and get away from a lot of the stuff that is resulting in the degradation and the degeneracy of our society. When you look at historically at the different religious movements that have had significant influence in the church or in the state, it always ends up corrupting both. Like the Anglican Church in England, the Catholic Church across Europe, like it's always a corrupting influence for both sides. It never does seem to work out where it actually promotes the things that it should, especially from the church side of it. Like it seems like when you look historically at when the Catholic Church had the most influence over the different kingdoms of Europe, that was when the church was the most corrupt. Like that's not something that should be striven for or like that shouldn't be a goal of Christians, is to have that direct influence on the state, because the state is a eternally corrupting influence.
Yeah, I agree. But, and of course there's this, I've been listening to a lot of these people that call themselves the post-libertarians. I'm not calling out or trying to bash this ideology, but one thing that I realize is that in one aspect, they are correct. We're never going to get into a utopia where there's no state. So the average libertarian who wants to get rid of the state and that'll solve all our problems, that is flawed beyond comprehension. We'll never get rid of the state, period. We're never going to get rid of the government, period. So it's there. But that doesn't mean that we need to mingle with the state, right? We just got to kind of treat it like, okay, it is what it is. Let's do our own thing. if we want to participate in society, we got to understand, well, there's this thing in our way. We kind of got to work with it and work around with it. But that's not like, force ourselves into this. It's, dividing people to begin with.
The one thing that I would, I guess, push back on is, well, first of all, I agree with the universalization of the imperialism, I guess is maybe a better word, from some of these historical empires. Okay, anytime you have an empire, there is going to be corruption. But let's scale this back. Let's take this back to a community level. If we have a neighborhood of, say, 100 households, okay, and we are we're a community where we all agree, that we are working together. You're going to have some sort of governing system, right, to oversee this community. And my point is that trying to make that secular, I think, is, if this governing body over, our covenant community, if we say this is, just purely secular, that's setting yourself, I think that's setting yourself up for failure. Whereas if we want to come back to so-called Christian nationalism, okay, I don't know how technical we're going to get here, in terms of, does the church, set the guidelines for the speed limits or the crosswalks, in this particular community. But my point is that those leaders on, the governing board should be informed and influenced, by the religion of the community. So, on one hand, I totally agree. When you've got this empire that is trying to universalize, all these cultures together, okay, it's not going to work out. But let's take it now to a little bit more micro level. How is it that I don't think that it's possible to separate, religion and law. And if you do try to separate the two, are you not just, inviting a corrupting force as a result?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I mean, that's kind of to kind of give away my direction with this. That's kind of where I wanted to go with this conversation was, as far as the Christian nationalism thing goes, I don't view it as a necessarily positive thing on a truly national level. Like I said, the foundational principles and ideals of Christianity are something that as a nation we should be returning to. But in terms of like the application of Christian nationalism as it is being defined in mainstream media and in the all of the screeching of the progressive left, that only works on a very local level. And that's one of those things that Mike brought up the post-libertarians, and I guess I'm one of those. Like that's one of the things that we kind of want to move towards and push for is using your local influence and your local political structure to be able to build those types of like the covenant community type things we were talking about earlier, where that is a part of what you do, and that is ingrained in your community and your society, and then you have that it's a micro version of that nationalism, because you're a confined nation of the people who live in your community.
I don't know if you heard, but Pete Quinones had an episode just the other day. It was a woman from Utah. She was not Mormon, but it was a great episode because I'm not from Utah either. Every time I tell someone I'm Mormon, they think I'm from Utah. I'm like, no, I'm from Chicago. I'm actually a Midwestern boy. But Utah is a different breed out there. But I thought it was a great episode because it showed how covenant communities could actually work as long as people have a similar ideology, right? Now, there's problems itself among the church members in that state, and there's a lot of wokeism that's infiltrated that, but that's mainly because we still hold to this idea that we're all part of this monolith called America, right? And so these woke ideas want to kind of infiltrate, even communities that would be covenant communities. But you mentioned Amish, right? So the Amish kind of remove themselves completely from the entire thing. So they're probably the best example we have about covenant communities out there, how they work. But they have to be tied culturally, linguistically, religiously. I mean, those are the only way it can work. Because this idea of multiculturalism is just a fallacy.
Well, and Amish are kind of a prime example of decentralization as far as that goes, because even though every Amish community is very similar in some ways, I don't believe that the separate Amish communities across the country are actually connected to each other in any like significant way. I mean, maybe I'm completely wrong on that, but to my knowledge, I'm pretty sure like they operate as independent. They effectively operate as independent nation states to themselves.
You're right.
Each Amish community is kind of its own thing. Like they all have very similar values and structures in the way they go about things, but they are incredibly individualistic as far as each community goes. Like it's and that's like, I believe maybe I just need to I need to shave the mustache and just go full Amish. Like I really do think that like the Amish styling of the way they build their communities, like I think that's a good example to kind of build off of. Like you don't have to return to like Uncle Ted's wet dream and do away with all technology, but at the same time, like there are some structural things to the way they put their society and their culture together that would really be foundationally beneficial to moving these ideas forward.
They are definitely Uncle Ted adjacent, I would say, and their communities are definitely. You use the word individualized. I would say that they are autonomous. Okay, and that each community is actually a little bit of a collective. As such, they're the idea of the individual is certainly not anything what we have here in the West. But I do have these. I do have these dreams of a theocratic nation as such, but that's not realistic. I think what's more realistic is exactly what we're talking about here, which is small pockets of communities and groups of people that are working together, that are kind of just pockets of freedom. And you mentioned, Mike, you mentioned Pete, just a moment ago, and Pete always talks about how these kind of in between the cracks, where freedom can kind of up amidst tyranny. And I don't think that it does us any good to talk about trying to take back some newspaper or Washington D.C., even if that is that's probably not even possible. But what is possible is for us to begin developing networks of families, communities together, because what we're living in right now can't sustain. Now, is it going to collapse next week, or is it going to be next year, or is it going to be a decade from now? We're not sure. But whenever that time comes, we need to have networks of groups of people that are ready and willing to help each other. That's the way I see it.
Justin, I was thinking when you were talking about the Amish communities. Now, I've actually never been to Pennsylvania. That's one of the 15 I've never been. So I'm not familiar with Amish communities themselves. I obviously know a little bit about their culture, but I think, and I don't want to dox you here, but you said you were from Indiana, Justin?
Okay. I'm undoxable. I'm all of my stuff is completely out in the open. So yeah. Yes, I live in Indiana currently. There's actually an Amish community, probably 20-25 miles from here. Also, where I grew up in Kentucky, there was an Amish community about 20 to 25 miles from where I grew up. So that's why I said I'm fairly familiar, and also like I don't know for a fact, nationwide, but I know that the ones here are quite a bit different from the ones back home. Like they still have a lot of similarities, but they're also very different.
Well, so I'm going to say this town because I was in Indiana in 2020, and I went to this little town called Shipshewana. And it's a great name for a town. It's in Indiana. It's more towards the Ohio side. It's on the east side of Indiana, up in the north. But I believe it was a Mennonite community. And Mennonites are very similar to Amish, except they do have technology. Like I drive there with my car, and they had the horse and buggies and everything like that. But they also had restaurants with lights on and stuff like that, so you can go eat, at night. So maybe that's an example there. I just thought it was funny.
The Mennonites. They're actually really unique and cool too, and like the way that they do their own communities, and they're also very they have a lot of differences between the different Mennonite communities. Like there was also one of those around home where I grew up, and they have a lot of they're allowed to use technology, but there are certain restrictions on it, like it can't be a new vehicle. It has to be used. It has to be a certain color. Like they have a lot of weird rules around how they go about doing that. But yeah, I mean, it's cool. And that's what I'm talking about. Like, we don't have to completely cut out technology, but if we have a community that's based on like everybody is sort of on the same page and you have those values and those ideals that you're all focused on as a community, then like that's the way that you implement the idea of Christian nationality in a way that it actually is effective and can work and can have positive influence. On a just a strictly nationalistic level, I just don't see it being there would be too much pushback. Community wise is where it has to go, and radical not segregation. Well, I mean, to some extent, segregation.
Segregation, say it. Segregation today.
I say to some extent, segregation is what I mean, shit. The left is moving back towards that anyway. So we may as well just go all the way with it and say, okay, well, we will all go live in our own place. And you see it on college campuses currently.
Yeah, I mean their whole thing is they want to go back towards segregation, even though their whole thing is like, oh, we don't want that. So it's kind of like an oxymoron. But it depends on the community. What's the opposite of segregation? Gentrification, right? And so if some community wants to have gentrification, fine, as long as they can live peacefully among each other and don't start a war with other segregated communities, then that's really what the American dream should be. But it's this idea that we're all one culture. That's just crap. It's not true. It never has been true. And whether it's coming from the left or the right, just that we're all one monolithic culture is just we'll never be there. It's just going to drive a wedge further and further until we have all out war here.
I've just never understood the purpose of the forced integration type stuff of government housing and changing zonings and stuff like that, and creating like low income housing in the middle of neighborhoods that are not that originally and stuff like that. Like it like I said before, when you look at like New York of the early 1900s, it was incredibly segregated, and it was considered like a good place. Like it was something that the rest of the world kind of aspired towards. And then you start forcing all of these different communities in on top of each other and making them become, gentrified. And that's where the whole thing starts to collapse.
Yeah, I think the opposite of segregation is forced integration, and that's since the 1960s. That's really been the Civil Rights Acts. We've been living under a new constitution since 1963, which is the 1964, which is the Civil Rights Constitution, and now and since then, you do not have the right of freedom of association. You can't say that I don't want to associate with you for whatever reason. And, because of that's a violation, of our Bill of Rights, First Amendment right that was written in to the Constitution 1787 or whenever it was ratified. But anyhow, the point here is that if you are going to build a Christian community, okay, and this is something that we haven't talked about in this discussion up until this point, which is if you have somebody that is in your community that does not hold your values, I think that you should have the right or the ability to ask that person or those group of people to leave, because their values are not only assuming that they're contradictory or perhaps even subversive, to the values of the Christian community. That's an entirely new angle that we haven't talked about.
I'm glad you brought that up. So the idea of forcible removal was brought up on a post on Twitter, I believe it was, that was not very Christian. And I would push back on that, because if you look at, I believe it was in Matthew, where Jesus said, like, if somebody is sinning and they're going against the church, that you speak to them. And if they continue to go along with those ways, then you take somebody else with you and you speak to them together. And if they continue, then you bring them before the entirety of the church and you speak to them as a group. And if they still won't do it, then you cast them out. You don't stop loving them, but you tell them you got to go. It's a very Christian thing to remove somebody. That is the solution ultimately. Like, there are steps to get there, but that is the solution, is to remove the cancerous element from the community.
Well, that's the idea of exile, right? I mean, exile is definitely more Christian than any kind of violence that you would have against somebody. But you can do that by just making them uncomfortable. Make them uncomfortable to live there. If everyone in the community has a similar value, right, we don't need to use a violent solution to exile them. They'll just leave on their own because they just don't feel comfortable doing that. That might be a lot easier said than done, but we certainly don't want, for lack of a better word here in this argument, outsiders to come into our community and infiltrate our values. So we have to stand strong in what we have. And I think that's a big problem, is that a lot of Christians, I don't know how strong their values really are. Because if they had strong values and they understood what their own doctrine teaches, then they would basically be able to exile the people who don't fit into that definition. Because I think a lot of American Christians are very weak. They're doctrinally ignorant. They don't know the teachings of Christ himself, and so they just accept all these outside ideas, and that's how we see it seeping into churches right now.
That's like the example I gave of like talking about taking somebody before the church and exiling them. If you ask the average just generic Christian if exiling somebody was appropriate, or if calling somebody out for their recklessly bad behavior was a good thing, they would probably tell you, no, Jesus said that you're supposed to love everybody and accept everybody. Yeah. And it's like, no, you clearly didn't read anything. Sorry, you're wrong. That your buddy Jesus is not the Jesus of the Bible.
That's a great point, Justin. And I went to a Christian college, decades ago, and I had a professor. He was some sort of anarchist. I don't know if he was a Christian anarchist or I'm not sure. But I took one of his religion classes, and he had us reading, kind of all of these postmodern, books. And honestly, I'm thankful that I was exposed to that at a kind of early age, because it was subversive, and I was exposed to what the left was up to long before it kind of became mainstream. And I remember reading one of these books from a Christian that was, openly homosexual. And they were trying to rationalize and justify, why it was okay, for to be openly homosexual, within the church and so forth. Now, I understand I'm stepping into a large, hole of poo-poo right here, but
that's not a problem at all, because the follow-up episode to this, so this will be my Monday podcast release.
Okay.
And the follow-up to this on Wednesday is I'm going to go through an article from the Gospel Coalition that talks about why you can't be pro LGBTQ and be a Christian. So
and no problem. So the idea here is that decades ago, they were already inverting the truth and also inverting the definition of love. Basically, what they were saying is that any discrimination, any discernment whatsoever, even telling somebody that they were acting in sin, was an act of hate. So that the only way that you can love somebody is for you to accept them. And there's all sorts of parallels, with this. Honestly, the progressive mindset is explicitly Protestant, and I was exposed to this very early on, because there's even a strain of like anti land rights, within Protestant Christianity. I mean, they are just a couple of steps from just full-blown atheism. They will even say that if you own your own property, I mean, this is just communism, right? They'll say, if you own your own property, you are denying somebody else access, to the property that you own. Therefore, that is hate. Okay? So you see how, they're just inverting truth. They're inverting, all of these definitions as such. I've gotten way out here into the weeds. I don't even know what the point was here necessarily. But essentially here, I think to kind of bring it home, if you're going to have a community, you have to have the ability to discern what it is that you stand for and what it is that you oppose. And if you have to embrace what it is that you oppose, eventually you will become what it is that you oppose.
Yeah, Patriot, I'm going to do a shout out to Trey 50 Daniels, since he's been in the comments a little bit here. When you say that the liberal mindset is inherently Protestant, I would say it's Puritan. And for folks in the South, they have a word for that. It's called Yankees. So the Yankees have infiltrated everything, and we just want to get rid of them because, and this comes from, again, Puritanism. If anyone is having fun outside of that, their ideology, then, all hell will break loose. So,
well, guys, you got anything else? Any other closing thoughts or anything else to add? This has been a really engaging conversation, and hopefully it's one that we might pick back up on and continue a little more as we kind of see how things unfold over the next few months with the midterms coming up and maybe the direction that things could potentially go. I know the Supreme Court, there are rumblings that the Supreme Court could be doing some more controversial things over the next year or so. So there could be expansions of some of the ideas that that promote the Christian nationalism talk. So we might have some fun follow up. Any closing thoughts or anything to plug, and we'll kind of wrap it up.
Sure, I'll go first. I'll just say any attempt to universalize Christian nationalism in its current structure, to reference our good friend 2-Bit podcast, is definitely 10 out of 10 on the Fed level. Stay away from it, guys. You're going to be targeted by the FBI and everything else. However, I think that we do need to begin thinking about internalizing our, more local covenant communities, Christian nationalism at the more micro level. And you can follow me at Patriot Way Media, but there's a, what is there, a number 1 at the very end instead of an A? Yeah, and patriotwaymedia.com. If you want some good laughs every now and then when I do my trolling. Thanks again, Justin.
Thanks for coming on.
All right.
Ahead,
Well, I also want to reference the 2-Bit podcast. And so even though I feel like we could go for 5 or 6 hours with this conversation, I'm glad that we're not. I got to pee and I got pizza waiting for me out downstairs. As far as, ideas go, I think the gist of this conversation is exactly right. I mean, like I said when I started, is that if we had a choice between the Christian ideal of Americanism, American Christianity, or this global idea, I'd choose the American nationalism idea. But I just don't think that's possible. I mean, because religion is such a personal thing. There's so many deep doctrines, and we can all say that let's live by biblical standards, but the different faith traditions don't even do that themselves. So it's not that I want to be blackpilled on the issue. It's just, it is what it is, I'll plug my podcast. It's The Invictus Mind. It's a kind of an eclectic show. Like I said, we talk about political freedom, financial freedom, and spiritual freedom. I do have a Latter-day Saint bent. So, we're going to try to get into that doctrine sometime. I'm going to throw this out there, Justin, and not to confuse too many of your listeners here, but I do believe that if we read the Book of Mormon, you'll learn a lot about Christian nationalism and all the problems that cause this kind of stuff. But I'll just leave it at that. If you want to hear more about why I say that, you got to have to listen to my podcast.
Excellent. Well, thanks, guys, a lot. This has been a very engaging conversation. It covered everything that I hoped it would, and then some. So thank you all so much again for coming on. And for everybody who's watching or listening, this will be my Monday podcast episode. And then, as I had teased earlier, I will be following this up with reviewing a Gospel Coalition article about why you can't be LGBTQ supportive and be a Christian. Also, there will be a live stream on Monday, September, I don't know, whatever Monday is, the 5th. Mark Metz and I are going to look at Dan Price and some of his shady dealings as the CEO of whatever his company was. He was the big progressive darling for giving everybody $70,000 a year and all of that stuff. Well, he's kind of a dirtbag. So Mark and I are going to go into that on Monday. Thanks again, guys. This has been great. And to everybody watching and listening, tune back in on Wednesday. Thanks.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Justin. Thanks, Mike.